welcome to Talking Leadership. You're with Eric Perez, and I thank you for joining me again on this ongoing podcast series. Before we get started, I would like to thank the major sponsor for the program, that being Sydney Fish Markets. For those of you travelling to Sydney for business or for pleasure, please get to the markets, enjoy what is seafood from around the country, fresh local seafood, particularly that coming in from Queensland. You can't go wrong by going to Sydney Fish Market, the premier fish market in the Southern Hemisphere. And now on to the program. Our guest today is the Executive Director of the Property Council of Australia, Queensland. So it's my great honour to welcome Mr. Chris Mountford to the podcast. How are you, Chris?
I'm very good, Eric. Pleasure to be here.
Chris, it's great to have you with us here. So for the benefit of the listeners, I worked with Chris many years ago in another life in local government, and given Chris's tenacity and leadership skills, he's worked his way to a very significant role in Queensland industry with the Property Council of Australia. So, Chris, look, I know you've got some significant background in leadership, so I'm looking forward to this discussion. So I want to start where I've started with every other podcast interviewee and just ask you, what was your first leadership role and why did you take that on, mate?
So the second job I had after university was the first job where I started to manage people or be in a leadership position of leading a team. So, and that was part of the attraction of taking on that role, was taking on something more significant and running a team. But I was very fortunate in the first role that I did have in local government. I think whilst there wasn't really, there certainly wasn't a responsibility for me to manage people. The organisation itself was very focused in on developing us each as individuals, and obviously also was very involved in a lot of particular policy areas and other things that were in a leadership space for local government. So in many respects, we were working on things that we as individuals and an organisation wanted to demonstrate leadership on, and so. Through that, I think I got a very early grounding in watching, other people and myself needing to sort of step up a little bit and demonstrate some of those leadership attributes.
In those early stages of your career, if I can step you back through that, were you looking specifically for leadership experience, or was that something that you looked for after that first role, or was it something that didn't really factor in until you had a bit of leg in any particular role?
Certainly not something that I was particularly looking for early on. So, when I graduated university, I was keen to get a job working sort of in that industry association space. It was something that I sort of identified as being an area of interest for me. So I thought it was intriguing to sort of be positioned in between government and, industry, or a set of stakeholders, and representing those stakeholders back to government. And so, primarily early on, I was more interested in learning my skill sets in and around, being in that industry association area and learning all of, the policy areas and the particular issues that the stakeholders, were confronting and needed us to take forward to government. So it wasn't necessarily something that I was searching for particularly early on. But then after a few years, sort of getting that grounding and looking for my next position, obviously the opportunity to step up and start to take on more responsibility. So as I said, leading a team of people, starting to work on understanding budgets and budgeting and taking more financial responsibility, engaging with a greater number of more senior stakeholders, increasingly those are the things that are appealing and enjoyable as I work through my career now.
Yeah, I can understand that. And again, one of the things that I saw when we were working in that local government space is you had leadership written all over you, mate. I don't know whether you saw that, but I had, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I think looking back on it, you were always going to be prepped for something like this. Where you've ended up is always a function of chances and opportunities as you take as things come up. So look, I just want to ask you, in your travels, Chris, have you found a distinction between the function of leadership and management?
Yeah, I think increasingly I'm probably more aware of it. I think there's absolutely things you do in a management space that are really part of delivering on your day-to-day job in terms of managing budgets, managing workflow, making sure that objectives are understood and people understand the path to get there. Leadership for me tends to fall a bit more into how you go about doing those things, the culture that you set as an organisation or as an individual running a team in and around you to encourage other people to want to work with you to deliver on those outcomes. So I think, for me, management's a bit more about, in many respects, the sort of sometimes transactional elements of operating and running a business, whereas the leadership component is the overlay that sits over the top, which is really about, how you do that and how you bring others along with you.
Let me unpack something, because I think you used the word culture there in the organisation. Is that an important element of the leadership role, at least from your experience?
Yeah, so in the different organisations I've worked in and under different leaders, I think what you do find is that the leader of the organisation, or the leadership group of the organisation in many cases, really does have a major impact on the culture of the place. So, and culture can mean, a lot of different things and reflect a lot of different views, I suppose. But I think that sort of self-awareness, the awareness of how other leaders in the business are behaving, how they're delivering on or communicating expectations and following through on those things is really critical, because that's sort of the underpinning of the culture. And ultimately, as an employee or as someone who's in a team, you're much happier going to work when you're in an enjoyable environment where you feel like there's alignment across the team on what the goals are. You feel as though the leaders within the business, understand what you're working towards and are working with you to deliver it. So I think that culture piece is incredibly important.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. And the experiences I've had myself with leaders around the place, it's that they set that cultural yardstick, and people either work to that or walk away from it in most cases. So look, I want to segue into another aspect of leadership, and that's how do you typically engage with an error or mistake that's attributed to your leadership, Chris?
So one of the things that I think I was sort of taught early on in my career is that the mistakes themselves are not really a problem. What becomes a problem is when someone either tries to cover it up, or doesn't acknowledgement, or doesn't own the mistake and work to fix it. So I think whether it's myself or someone in the team or across our organisation, the culture and the expectation is if you make a mistake, you put your hand up and you say, look, I've made a mistake. I've got a plan to try and fix it, or can you work with me to try and resolve this? But I think the most important thing around that is you've got to have a culture where it's okay to acknowledge you've made a mistake, and the team works together to resolve it. Because that sort of transparency or openness around that is actually what will drive a better outcome at the end of the day, and will give people across the team the confidence that they can have a crack at something, knowing that if they don't quite get it right, that it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, would tend to very much agree with that. So what, again, in your travels, what have you found is the most difficult part of being a leader?
Look, I think for me, I've been fortunate to go through a number of different sort of 360-degree reviews and, sort of self-assessment processes. And I find those things incredibly valuable. So I think, one of the more challenging things sometimes is to actually seek out feedback and hear it sort of openly and honestly, without sort of overlaying your own opinions on it. And then, taking the time to reflect on it and think about how you can change and improve. I think sometimes that feedback element for a leader can be a little bit confronting. But it's certainly something that over my career I've learnt increasingly the value of identifying people whose feedback you really do trust, seeking that out at times and acting upon it, even if it is a bit uncomfortable.
Sure. And so do you find more, just to elaborate a bit on that, do you find it more valuable coming from a third party that's done an assessment with you and doesn't really know how you operate, or do you find more value in getting feedback from the team and then your board, so to speak? So do you find some differences there?
Yeah, I think they're all very different. I think they're all quite valid, and you need to take them from the perspective from which they're provided from and meld it together into your own thinking a little bit. So, absolutely, over the years, whether you do sort of, an MBTI type understanding of yourself, or a Belbin type understanding, or, we've in the past used the human synergistics model as well to understand our culture and traits. Those sort of independent, verifiable third-party assessments certainly give you a sense of benchmark, your preferred style, how others might perceive the way that you're operating. And then I think, and that's sort of almost in some respects a bit qualitative. And then, overlaying that with the honest and clear feedback from people that you know and trust, that you believe will give you an honest opinion and will give you constructive feedback, I think really rounds that out quite well.
Sure. Look, one thing that's come up after asking this question in some of the other podcast sessions was this idea of mentoring. So do you currently, do you have formal or informal mentoring relationships set up? Do you actively seek assistance from, say, a peer group to deal with issues as a leader?
Yes, I've been pretty fortunate in this space over a number of years. So, certainly the organisation that I'm with now has invested in formal mentoring for me with professional mentorship over the years, which has been really, really valuable and is a quite structured way of working through that process and doing a bit of self-assessment. And then, look, the other thing that I'm very fortunate in my role is that I have, access to a great number of fantastic industry leaders from across the property sector who are not only heavily invested in the organisation, but typically, find themselves investing in the people in the organisation as well. So, absolutely, I get sort of informal mentoring and advice from, presidents of the Property Council in Queensland, board members, people who are on our committees who've, now worked with me for a decade through the organisation and give me personal and professional advice along the way. And sometimes that comes through in a sort of an unsolicited sort of way, but it is delivered from sort of a mentoring standpoint. And other times I'll go and seek out people's opinion as well.
That's fantastic, and it's quite a fortunate position to be in. So, Chris, let's talk about something a bit more positive, other than mistakes and difficulties of being a leader. How do you measure success as a leader, mate?
I think that's a really good question. I think when you think about the team and the environment, the people that you have around you, I think you sort of can measure success by some numbers like tenure and how long people stay with an organisation or how long they stay in your team, how engaged they are through engagement surveys and things like that. So there are some things that I think are measurable in terms of the team. There are also many more things in terms of the culture of the team and how people feel while they're at work that are probably a bit harder to measure, but I think you can sense as a leader, or you should be aiming to try and understand and sense as a leader around, whether people feel like they're having success or enjoying work. And I think, then there's sort of, that's sort of the team side, and then there's certainly the bit about whether you're succeeding from a business standpoint. Are you hitting your financial targets? Are you, for us, delivering the sort of policy and advocacy that our members expect from us? Are we communicating effectively and getting the level of stakeholder engagement that we would like to see from our membership? So that it's a mix of all of those things, I think.
Yeah, and that's a pretty what's the word I'm looking for? It's a holistic view of success, and I'm not surprised that you mentioned again your team and your culture and the people around you, because I think in conversations we've had not related to this podcast, you've mentioned that you've had some people in the team that have been with you for as long as you've been in the organisation. That's quite a reflection on you as a leader, that they've valued the place enough to stay with you as the leader, and that's a good, for me, indicator of what I've seen, at least in my travels, that somebody's doing the right thing and that someone being yourself. So look, I've got some questions here, more statements to get your head around and see what your view of them is. So the first one being, on the job experience develops a better leader.
Yeah, I think to be a leader in an organisation, you need to come with a reasonable degree of experience and understanding of what you're bringing to the table. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have deep leadership experience. You might be stepping up into a leadership role, but you might have a deep understanding of the issues or the way the organisation operates or the stakeholders or whatever the case may be. So I think there's certainly an aspect of learning on the job and continuous learning and as I said before, trying to get that feedback and continually improve. That I'm not necessarily a fan of the idea that you can just sort of throw someone in the deep end without some grounding, a level of support, and expect them to be successful in a leadership position.
Yeah, agreed. So second statement, formal education helps to develop a better leader.
I think, it depends on the type of career you've had and the roles you've had and what you've been exposed to along the way. So, if you worked in an organisation where you didn't get a lot of, external advice or interaction, you were very internally focused, I think there would absolutely be a role to play to extend yourself through formal education and trying to I guess, build your capability and understanding through that mechanism. Equally, if you're in a role that is, does give you access to a great many, number of opportunities that might be more informal, then maybe formal education is a less significant, focus for you. So, I've I've left uni not undertaken any, in-depth formal education. I've certainly continued to do some professional development courses and other things. But, part of that is because, in my current role and in my recent roles, I've been very fortunate to be, heavily exposed to a lot of external influences and information that have meant that I've kind of had a continuous learning environment around me.
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting way to couch that. So final statement, and I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say about this one. Leaders are born, not made.
I think it's probably a combination of both things. I think, certainly some people seem to more naturally, feel comfort in a leadership position, but there's a huge role to play in terms of personal growth and development. Things we talked about before, like mentoring and role modeling and learning to be a leader that equally is important. So, I don't think it's necessarily that, a one or the other. I think it's a combination of people with natural skills and a desire to take on leadership roles, but then also in order for them to be successful in delivering on that, there's going to need to be, through their career, role models that show them what good leadership looks like, opportunities to grow their leadership skills and a whole range of other things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Look, this next part of the podcast, and this is where I get to ask some questions around some of the studies that I'm still looking at in terms of leadership, and just want to get your thoughts and views on the following. And again, it's not to elicit agreement or disagreement on the particular work that I'm doing, but more about these particular leader capabilities in your experience. So the first one being the two critical ones for success as a future leader being strategic thinking and foresight. What are your views on those two as critical leader capabilities, Chris?
Yeah, I think increasingly being able to see what's coming and what's ahead, either from an industry standpoint or the organisation standpoint, or from an internal business unit standpoint and what might be affecting that. I think that's increasingly important as things change rapidly and disruption continues to occur. And so I think there's a nimbleness that's required in your thinking as a leader to be able to adapt to those, see those things and try and adapt to them. So certainly, I think that's a critical skill, but I think it also needs to be coupled with the capability to then not just sort of strategize about it or think it, but to be able to convert that into an actionable plan that can be understood by people to actually go forward and make whatever change may be required.
So is that in the space of being a good communicator? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's, certainly communication is part of it, but also it's a bit about, a capacity to operationalize the plan. So, being able to not just see what's ahead, but understand how your business can respond to that, and being able to put a plan in place that your business can actually deliver. It's one thing to sort of, have a sense or a view of what the future is, but if you can't sort of operationalize that thinking, then it's not of much value. Yeah,
I very much agree. So, Chris, we're at the final question here, and I know we as in I put myself in the same age bracket as yourself, but I will ask this question of you. If you had a chance to talk to a younger version of yourself, what would you say to yourself what would you tell yourself about being an effective leader?
Probably one of the things that I'd be thinking about talking to myself about would be around, taking opportunities early to really learn more about your own style and your way of operating. So that was sort of something that I stumbled into early in my career. So, as I said before, doing some of those different sort of external assessments, whether it's, an MBTI or a Bellman or whatever the case may be, because I think if you can, early on in your career, start to get a really strong understanding of what your natural preferences are and start to get a sort of a lens on how you behave and how you operate and how others perceive that. I think that gives you quite a solid grounding for then taking on a lot of the challenges. I think if you're not sort of self-aware early on, or you're not, continuing to build your self-awareness, you don't really have a base to work off.
That's that's a very positive way to end the podcast, Chris. Look, I do appreciate your time. I know that you're busy, like we all are in this crazy world. So for the podcast listeners, I've been speaking with Chris Mountford. Again, Chris, thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Eric. Anytime.
Thanks everyone again, and I'll catch everyone on the next podcast.